Liberia was founded in the early 1800s as an American alternative to abolition. The United States was a slave society, and the dominant white culture and the imperatives of American political economy at that time did not predispose the American government to support abolition. And so Liberia was founded under the principle of colonization, but as a colony of an American philanthropic organization, the American Colonization Society, not as a colony of the American government. The American government provided $100,000 to the American Colonization Society, but not to go on record as supporting a colony of the American government. That money was given to support the immigration of what they called artisans who would come to the West African coast to prepare a receptacle or receptacles to house recaptives who were intercepted on the high seas, having been taken by slave traders to Europe and the United States. And this is important. Liberia was never a colony of the United States. Neither was the American government prepared in the 1800s to go on record to say, yes, we are supporting this establishment in a direct way. It was about finding ways to say that what we're doing is to help the recaptives go back. That's the money, that is why the money was given. Not to immigrate black people to come here and form a country, a state. And so the American colonization established in Liberia, a governmental system of command and control. The original constitution of the 1800s vested executive and judicial authorities in the representative of the American Colonization Society. Even when there was a legislature, the head of the American Colonization Society was vested with veto powers over legislative decisions. Settlers demanded greater participation in the governance of their affairs and consequently challenged the absolute authority of the Colonization Society. The settlers of the coastal settlements demanded greater autonomy in the political and economic affairs of their communities. This led to struggles for constitutional changes, so that in 1839, a new constitution was promulgated which gave considerable local or county level autonomy. So there was a form of decentralization back there in 1838, 1839. But the British and the French colonialists were expanding at that time, and Liberia was threatened. And with the United States unwilling to assume full responsibility for the protection of the territory that Liberia claimed, the settlers took recourse in international law by declaring their independence as a sovereign state, and they designed a new constitution. The 1847 constitution took back the autonomy or decision-making authorities that had been vested in the counties by the Commonwealth Constitution. It established an over-centralized government arrangement and vested enormous powers in the president. This constitutional arrangement was seriously challenged. In the referendum held in September 1847, the Constitution was stoutly opposed by the people of Bassa and Sino counties. Fighting broke out in Bassa, and in Sino, hardly any polls were allowed to open. The colonial physician, Dr. Luganbill, reported that out of 600 registered voters, only 269 cast ballots during that referendum. And this was less than 50% of the electorate. And of those voting, 211 voted in favor of the Constitution. 58 were opposed to adopting the Constitution. So Luganbill argued that if all those who opposed the vote had voted, the tally would have been even much closer. Perhaps if the Constitution had been adopted, it would have been adopted by a margin of not more than 50 votes. This is Luganbill's predictions, his own analysis. And why am I making this point? I'm making this point because the Constitution, which established a unitary state in Liberia and was declared adopted in 1847, it was declared adopted amid widespread disagreements and violent conflicts among the settlers themselves. This was only among the settlers. We're not talking about the problem now of how you cross the line of settlers. So what we later began to call a sacred document, our Constitution, was in fact a document profoundly contested. That, I think, is extremely significant for us today, especially so when questions of constitutional reform remain high on the agenda. Now, the Declaration of Independence and the adoption of a controversial constitution did not put an end to contestation of Liberian sovereignty and territorial integrity by the colonial powers, especially the British and the French. These colonial powers demanded that the Liberia demonstrate effective control of the territories claimed. In order to be able to extend that control over territories claimed, the Liberian government, around the turn of the century, organized the Liberian Frontier Force and organized an interior bureaucracy. Those became the two major instruments of state control, of state occupation, and of state expansion. So what we have here is that in the making of Liberia, a governmental system was established that first centralized powers in a central state, a national government, and then began to concentrate powers in the hands of the president. Because both the Liberian Frontier Force and the interior bureaucracy were all under the direct control of the president. And then later we did one more thing. In addition to establishing these institutions of state control, the strategy for economic development that was adopted by Liberia, which, by the way, in many parts is being used today, was a strategy of giving concessions to international companies as the mainstay of the economic development arrangement. The concession economy, you could call it. In 1847, for example, President Roberts, having just recently returned to the presidency, awarded the first concession. It was to a British firm, a British group of Samuel Forbes and George Wells. They were engineers and contractors of London. The agreement gave Forbes and Wells, quote, rights to construct railways, tramways, docks, landing stages and jetties, warehouses, and other facilities for business and commercial use, and to explore and exploit mineral deposits, unquote. It also granted the right to, quote, erect upon all government and public land, free of charge, structures necessary for the pursuit of these activities. And in return, the government was to receive 10% of the net profits on all gold and silver and other minerals extracted by the company, and 50% of the net profits from the commercial use of the railways and tramways, after the deduction of a 6% interest on capital investment. Now, the establishment of the natural resource concession economy as the main strategy for economic development at that time did a number of things. Imagine we already had the concentration of powers in the hands of the president. And then we begin to put all this economic power in the hands of the president. In this way, the presidency was freed from dependence on other resources, on taxes from local people, because now it was rent that was coming directly to the government. And it freed the presidency from a relationship with the people that would hinge upon the people's support for the government through the payment of taxes. And this policy continued to drive our economic development on and off, except during the Barclay period. It continued to drive our economic development for most of our existence. By the post-World War II years, when the reins of authority fell in the hands of Mr. Tubman, President Tubman was able, with these resources, to build up an extensive patronage machine. And that patronage system expanded year by year over his 27-year stay in power. He did not invent the patronage system, but he refined it and expanded it considerably. So, what we have, therefore, was a shift from government with sovereign authority to the ACS, the American Colonization Society, a shift from that to government to a centralized authority system in which powers were concentrated in the hands of the president, and now the presidency further strengthened by rent and resources from the concession economies. That has been a significant factor that has led to the weakening of our institutions of government, to the strengthening of the presidency, and to denying our system of government of the resiliency that is important to withstand shocks. And this is my underlying point, that once you have a high concentration of power in one office of government, and once that office comes under an attack, the system disintegrates, because no other branch of government, no other institution of governance is capable then of carrying its own weight. They've all been dwarfed and weakened by excessive and over-centralized presidential authority. That has been a major factor in our history.